I'm Chris Pullen, the Group CEO of Staffline. So I'm responsible for the whole of the Staffline group, and I'm really delighted that Matthew Taylor can join us this afternoon to talk to us about the report that he's done. So a bit about Matthew. He has been Chief Executive of the RSA since 2006. So that's the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. He's a serious blogger, having blogged over 1,200 times on topics ranging from policy, politics, public service reform and cultural theory. Prior to becoming Chief Executive of the RSA, Matthew was Chief Advisor on political strategy to the Prime Minister Tony Blair, and he was Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research between 1999 and 2003. He's written numerous articles and is a regular panellist on Radio 4's Moral Maze. So in October 2016, a couple of years ago, Matthew was appointed as the chair of the Review of Modern Employment established by Theresa May. So the Taylor Review report, which you've all heard of, and I expect most of you have had a good read through, entitled Good Work, was published in July last year. The review, its findings and recommendations are now in the government's consultation phase, so an important phase, and we'll be inputting into that as a standalone organisation. So from my perspective, being an organisation that deploys 60,000 workers into blue-collar industry every single day, we are absolutely entitled to put a really strong perspective across into this consultation. And we'll also be feeding into our trade body, as Kevin suggested this morning. But what I really thought would be incredibly useful is if Matthew came along, talked to us about the review, his thoughts behind it, so that you can really hear from the horse's mouth, with the aim of dispelling quite a lot of that uncertainty. But just before I hand over to Matthew, I just thought I'd give you Staffline's perspective from a high level. And that is that we wholeheartedly support all of the principles and sentiments of the review. We think it's absolutely rooted in the right place. And that is encapsulated in the title Good Work, that all work should be good work. And we passionately believe that flexible work should also be good work. And we will do everything we possibly can to make sure that flexible work through us is good work. And again, I'm sure Matthew will explain what the concept of good work is all about. And as one of the largest workforces in the UK, so again, that's 60,000 people that we deploy every day, we have got a great opportunity to use all of that scale for good. And we certainly intend to do that. And we'll do everything to ensure that flexible work is that good work now, as soon as we can, and into the future. And for example, we're not afraid to accept more commitment towards our workers. So the review suggests the right to permanent work after 12 months as one of the recommendations. Now this could be with us rather than with you, the end customer, for example. Our size and scale means that we don't really have an issue with offering permanent employment to workers that have been with us for 12 months. So on a peak day, we deploy 60,000 people. On a less busy day, perhaps we deploy 45,000 people. So there's 30,000 people that we can deploy around our network, and we can have a serious commitment to for the long term. So we're ready to accept that sort of commitment going forward, and we think that can only be a good thing. We also would welcome more compliance and regulation if that's deemed to be necessary, in particular around things like Swedish derogation, so pay between assignments. So if there is indeed found to be evidence of companies abusing Swedish derogation, then from our perspective, let's just have better regulation. We know that it's increasingly important that we ensure flexible work is good work, because it's a really vital part of the economy. So part of the reason why our British economy is so successful is because of the flexibility of our labour market. And we also know that increasingly people want to work flexibly where and when they can, and you, our customers, need flexibility in your workforce in this ever competitive environment. I'm absolutely committed to making sure that we follow the principles of good work, so it is no less attractive than permanent work as far as we can make it. So on that note, over to you.
So it's great to be here. So what I'm going to talk about is I'll talk about my review, but for a while, just to remind you of the context of it. It is slightly out of date now because it reported a year ago, and we've had the government's response to my report. But it's, I think, helpful to remind you of the context of that report and the principles that underlay it. I'll talk a little bit about the government's response and where we are. I'm not going to engage in great detail with some of the specific issues around kind of Swedish derogation and right to request and variable minimum wage. We can talk about those things in Q&A, I think. And then I want to talk about employment engagement a bit, because I think that one of the great things about talking at a Staffline event is the commitment that the organisation has to employee engagement. I want to talk about how important that is. And then finally, if I've got time, I'd just like to say some more general things about technology and work, because most of the time now, I still talk about the review, but I talk more broadly about technology and work, and I think there's some important ideas and arguments that we need to engage with and some traps that we need to avoid. So the context of the review, when Theresa May asked me to do it, first of all, a very strong labour market, and I was at pains and have always been at pains to say that whilst we need to address issues about quality of work, particularly quality of work at the bottom end of the labour market, that mustn't be done at the expense of our record in terms of job creation and low unemployment. And I still adhere to the view, which is, apart from the very exceptional circumstances, any job is better than no job. It gives people an opportunity to progress, and the outcomes of unemployment are very bad in terms of people's general health and well-being. So getting people into work and having jobs for people is the priority, and nothing we should do should detract from that. Secondly, also, as we've heard, I'm a great fan of flexibility. I think flexibility is a good thing. I think it's part of why we've got a strong employment record. I think that most people who work in non-standard ways choose to work in non-standard ways, whether that's part-time work or temporary work or indeed gig work. So I don't subscribe to the view which is that all forms of non-conventional work are somehow exploitative and problematic. However, the reason I was asked to do the review is there genuinely are problems, and those problems are particularly concentrated at the bottom end of the labour market. And so it's those people who are most likely to have low pay, most likely to be living in poverty, who are also the ones who are most likely to be suffering bad quality work, not being treated with decency and with respect. And the other bit of context is this, that there is arguably, and I don't want to exaggerate this, but there is built into the way in which our employment system works certain dynamics which could lead to quite fast change unless we get the framework right. And so one of the things that people misunderstood about my work is there was an assumption that all I was really talking about was a balance of interest between firms and managers on the one hand and workers and unions on the other. And actually, a lot of the debate is about businesses who are competing, but they're competing in a context in which there is too much scope for people to play the rules. And so, if you look at the distribution sector, for example, you'll find firms that employ people as workers or as employees and give them their protections, and those firms also pay national insurance, employers' national insurance. And then there are other firms that have found a way of, for example, arguing that one day a month you can substitute your work and get someone else to do your round, of saying those people are not workers and therefore they don't get worker rights, and therefore, more importantly, the company doesn't have to pay national insurance payments on them. So one of the things I needed to address is how do we have a level playing field for competition so that what wins is innovation, investment, high quality, not your capacity to circumvent the rules by denying people their rights or avoiding paying the tax which you should be paying, on which the country relies. So one of the reasons I needed to think about our framework was because of that danger of industries reaching tipping points. So I hear, I don't know if there's any data yet, but I hear that in the road haulage sector and in the home removal sector, there is a growth in people who are saying that they're drivers, they're removal staff are self-employed, they'll be employed through platforms rather than employees. And the fact of the matter is, if you're running a firm and you're paying national insurance and you're looking after your worker rights, it's almost impossible to compete with a company that's managing to avoid those responsibilities. So that's why we need a level playing field and to avoid a kind of race to the bottom. And the final thing about the review was, which was something that I kind of decided to put into it, and I'm very happy when we talk about this because I have a kind of whole background in policy, and that's basically a tragic background because most policy fails. And you didn't say when you introduced me that actually my job for Tony Blair, I don't put my job that I did for Tony Blair on my CV because basically I was employed by him in his third term, and he said to me, there's two things I want you to help me guarantee, Matthew. One is that I remain popular, and the other is that New Labour remains in control of the Labour Party. So this is not something I talk about a great deal because obviously I wasn't terribly successful in either of those tasks. But so I see a lot of policy fail, and one of the reasons that policy fails is because it lacks legitimacy. So if people believe a thing is the right thing to do, the public, you think something is the right thing to do, then the policy is quite likely to succeed. So no one's going to go back to smoking in pubs and restaurants. No, in Scotland, they'll never go back to Scotland being run as a department of kind of Whitehall. These things are changes which people subscribe to, they think they're right, and they stick. And so for me, I wanted to get across the idea of good work, because if people didn't believe in good work, if people don't think that good work for everyone is possible, then my recommendations have a danger of just kind of falling away, because people say, well, that's fine, but it's not practical. So I made a strong argument for good work, and the grounds for that argument were as follows, very briefly. Firstly, that we have seen an enormous growth in the number of people in this country in work poverty, in work poverty. Now, the social contract that we offered in the post-war era was a social contract that basically said to people, and it was primarily saying it to men at that stage, if you have a job, you will become better off every year, and you will be secure, you'll be economically secure, including into your retirement. Now, that is no longer an offer that we make, and one hopes that one day the economy will pick up and we may be able to make some kind of offer like that again. But if we're not able to guarantee people that having a job will lead to growing affluence and security, then we should at least say to people that they will get fairness and dignity at work. So it's the basis of the social contract. Secondly, good work matters because bad work isn't just bad for people, but it has bad externalities. Bad work leads to people dropping out of work, so they're not paying taxes, they're claiming benefits, they're more likely to end up being part of the reason why it takes you 2 weeks to get an appointment to see your GP. So there are externalities in terms of health and welfare of bad work. Thirdly, and this is something I'll refer to later on, but thirdly, bad work is part of our productivity problem. So, the productivity issue we've got here, the fact that it takes us 5 days to make what it takes the average German worker 4 days to make. That's a complex issue. But almost certainly, and all the business leaders I speak to who think about this in any seriousness recognise this, a big part of it is management, the quality of management in the British economy, and central to that is people management. So if we had better work, it would be part of a strategy for improving productivity. And in fact, the organisation that's been set up by the government under the auspices of Charlie Mayfield from John Lewis, called Be the Business, which is all about boosting productivity, has put absolutely the heart of its strategy human resources, people management, and employee engagement. The fourth reason good work matters is because technology is coming, and technology is going to change things, and I'll say something about that at the end if I have time. And the final reason is this. I hope all of you will, at the end of the day, if you're in a place that's having elections, make sure you vote before the polls close this evening. We have a story about us as citizens in civil society, and that is that we should vote, we should get involved, we should be heard, we should, to coin a phrase you might remember, take back control. But sometimes we don't apply that in the workplace. So we have this odd idea that we want people to be active, engaged, and listened to and respected in civil society, but when they go to work, they should just do what they're told and keep their mouths shut. And I think that is an increasingly untenable position to have. If we believe in citizenship in society, we ought to believe in citizenship at work. If we think people should be respected and listened to in civil society, we think they should be respected and listened to at work as well. So those were all the arguments I made for good work. And when I look at the government's response, the thing that most pleases me about it is that they seem to have accepted that principle good work. My report was called Good Work, and I don't know how long it took the Civil Service Committee to decide this, but when they published their response, it too was called Good Work. Critical to this is that the government has identified that good work is a key part of its industrial strategy. So it's saying that good work is not just a kind of socially nice thing to do. It's not just about looking after hard-working families or just about managing, or whatever phrase one wants to use. It is seen by the hard-headed folks in the business department as being part of our industrial strategy, part of making our economy successful. So I'm very pleased about that. I'm very pleased that the idea of good work seems to pop up everywhere, and I get asked to speak about it, and all sorts of people are thinking about it, and hopefully that's part of what we're doing here this afternoon. In terms of the nitty-gritty of the report, I would give the government's response 4 out of 10, but I should kind of clarify that in 2 ways. First of all, 4 out of 10 is not bad. There is, I don't know how many of you live in London, but actually just in Westminster it's very hard to find, but there's a graveyard for abandoned reviews. There's no gravestones, they're just buried very deep down, and nobody knows they're there. And that, I was worried that might happen to my review, so I took various measures, which I'm happy to describe, most of which I wasn't supposed to do, to make sure that it wasn't forgotten and that it was in the public domain. And so the fact that the government has responded in detail, has responded positively, is all good. So 4 out of 10 is much better than the average independent review gets. But if you're asked to do an independent review, remember that. But more importantly, that 4 could go up to 8, because the reason it's only 4 is because there's a lot of stuff still being consulted about. And that includes the variable minimum wage, it includes the right to request, it includes a whole lot of stuff about agency work. So most of the substantive stuff is out for further consultation, and I'm doing everything I can to encourage the government to be bold about how it responds to that consultation process. And at the moment I still remain hopeful about that. And we can talk, as I said, about some of those detailed issues in Q&A. So 2 other things I want to talk about before I finish, and so that there is plenty of time for us to have that conversation. Employee engagement. And as I said, it's great to be able to talk about employee engagement at a Staffline event, because Staffline is an organisation profoundly committed to this. And I should say that when we do talk about some of the specific recommendations that I make, particularly around kind of agency working, non-standard working, I think if everybody worked like Staffline work, then in a sense you wouldn't have needed my review in the first place, because it is best practice and it's very impressive. And I'm particularly impressed by that commitment to employee engagement. It is simply a fact that we have some rather old-fashioned attitudes in Britain which we need to change. So when I talked about good work, I've talked about the principles of good work, but there was another reason I talked about good work. And I talked about good work because I wanted to address 2 assumptions which still exist, I'm afraid, in our society. And they're not really mentioned in polite company. People kind of avoid saying it in case it makes them look reactionary, but they are still felt. And those 2 assumptions are these. First of all, a kind of master and servant view of work. And I've talked a bit about that. A view that the best way to maximise efficiency at work is to maximise the pressure that you put on people and minimise their scope for autonomy and voice. And that view, I'm afraid, is still prevalent, or far too prevalent. It doesn't really exist in the same way in other countries. It's a kind of peculiar manifestation of kind of British thinking. It's not entirely the fault of employers. Trade unions have themselves, I'm afraid, made a contribution to this kind of view of the workplace. And the second view is that there just always will be crap jobs, and I'm glad I have, one's glad one hasn't got it, and one doesn't want one's kids to get them, but there just will be crap jobs, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I profoundly think that's wrong. And again, one of the things that's so positive about Staffline is your commitment to the idea that that is wrong. There is no reason why any job, regardless of what it does, can't be a job that gives people. In the phrase that I used in my report, page 1 of my report, I said every job should be fair, decent, with scope for fulfilment and development. And there is no reason why any job shouldn't be fair and decent, shouldn't give people some scope for a sense of fulfilment at work, and shouldn't give people some scope, if they want it, to be able to develop in their skills or develop in their future career. So employee engagement is very much part of that story. It's part of that story of believing that companies that engage their employees will get better productivity. It's part of addressing the statistic which Staffline use a lot, which is the survey that found 83% of people say that they don't feel fully engaged in work. So there's an enormous gain that could be had if we had people who did feel fully engaged at work. Now, I talk about that principle quite a lot in the report, and there's one specific recommendation which I'm pushing as hard as I can on, which is just to make it easier for staff, if they want it, to be able to have rights to information and consultation and representation. You know, it's a tiny step towards the kind of model of industrial partnership which is taken for granted in most parts of Europe, but I think it's an important step. Now, I should emphasise, there's a kind of soft side of staff engagement. When I say soft, I don't mean it's unimportant, but there's a soft side which is about being nice to people and engaging people and the use of technology to enable feedback and all those kinds of things. But it's also important, I think, that if staff feel they need it, there is also someone they can talk to who can represent them safely, who can raise issues with management. Think, for example, of our rising awareness of sexual harassment at work. Think of the importance of having somebody that you might be able to go to express concerns about your manager, who you know can express those concerns without finding their job in any kind of jeopardy, because that's their role. But also the more basic right just for people to know what's going on at work and to have some insight into what is being planned by their employers. So I think employment engagement is a really important part of the story of good work, and I'm happy to talk about that further.
Yeah, the way you talk about change, and that change is a constant that happens all of the time, and of course we are going to adapt and cope. And part of the way that we look at the future of work and how things are going to go in the future is that we have a tight labour market, as described extensively this morning, and we're all aware of it and the things that are contributing to that. But of course we will find a way and we will adapt. And we're deploying technology and implementing a technology which is essentially forcing us into the best possible employee worker engagement environment that we can. And at the same time that's addressing hopefully this master and servant relationship, so we have a much better two-way dialogue with the people that work for us, and we transition more quickly than we would have otherwise done in a cultural shift program by having this technology pushing us along and getting the direct feedback. So I think that overall we will cope with this change, but we just need to use technology to push us along and help and support us in those decisions.
And I think just one example of that is that I think there's a combination of two, one good thing and one bad thing. We will see a substantial growth in the number of people working later in their lives. The bad thing will be people who will retire without sufficient pension income. But the good thing is, and it's one of the reasons I think flexible work is great, platform work is great, is that we're more flexible ways for older people who don't want to work full time, but do want to work from time to time to be able to do that. So, whilst I absolutely see, and you've done really good work on this, that the impact that Brexit may have in terms of labour supply, there are other things which may come into play which will bring in new workers.
So, if we can we get to the sort of nitty-gritty of a couple of your recommendations? So it'd be good to understand the thinking that went into them, and actually what you think might be the consequence, or realistically what might be implemented. So a significant one from our perspective in the agency world is the concept of the one-sided bargain, and therefore a flexible worker, a temporary worker, should be paid more and have a higher national living wage. Now, of course, from our perspective, that puts a very negative connotation on flexible working, and I just don't like the negative connotation to begin with. But what's behind that?
So I think that there's two things there. First, the principle, and then secondly, the practicalities. So the principle is this, that although some people are very happy working with a 0 hours contract or a very low hours contract, for other people, particularly in those economies, local economies, which are weak, where they don't have a great deal of choice, those kinds of contracts do cause problems. It's less likely they'll get much less likely to get a mortgage or a loan. It increases their sense of insecurity. It also, because of course they don't have a kind of contract, they don't have any guaranteed future work, it also means they're even less likely to raise concerns about what's happening to them at work, because they can simply be denied hours. They've obviously no rights to claim unfair dismissal or anything like that. So the principle is, if you want a hyper flexibility in your workforce, if you want to be able to bring people in literally on the day and get them to work without, in a sense, the reciprocation of responsibilities that comes with more conventional longer term forms of employment, then it is reasonable that you should pay some kind of premium for that. And the goal there is twofold. Firstly, that it might mean that for those paid, this is just people on the minimum wage. For those people on the minimum wage, they get slightly more money in their pocket, which I don't think is a bad thing. And secondly, actually I think the effect of it would be to encourage employers to think a little bit harder about how they could actually guarantee more hours to those people. Because I think that whilst there are some industries, some businesses that use those kind of highly flexible forms of work, because they're absolutely right, there are some that use them as a conventional form of employment, and people who've been on these contracts for years, and I think it's just laziness, to be quite honest. You know, if you're a manager, I mean, I run an organisation, I run the RSA, I have to make a judgment in the spring, or actually in the winter, about how big we're going to be next year. And if I undershoot, then we'll be turning away work we could have done, and if I overshoot, we'll have a deficit and I'll have to respond to my trustees. And that's the part of risk that I take on as a manager. If you want a totally flexible workforce, which means that you don't ever have to take that risk because you can scale down and scale up whenever you want to, and it's the individual worker who has to bear the brunt of that shift, then I think, as I say, you should think as hard as possible about whether or not you could do better. Now, the second question, though, actually, as it always is the case with these things, is the implementation, the detail of it. And my view, I responded at length. I've done 3 blogs responding to government consultations. And on this one, my view is that if it does go ahead, it should go ahead on the basis of 20% of the minimum wage, a 20% uplift, if someone is not given notice of more than 2 weeks. So we really are talking about people who've got very low levels of security. So they're being asked to work with less than 2 weeks' notice. And we're talking about those people, only those people on minimum wage, getting a 20% uplift. The final thing I would say on this is that we are almost alone in the world in not having any regulations requiring people to be paid overtime pay. In most other jurisdictions, there are legal overtime pay requirements. And there has in this country been a massive growth in unpaid overtime in the last few years. Now, my job in my review is to focus on people at the bottom, but this is an issue across the labour market, actually. And so I think if my recommendations got people to think a little bit more about whether or not the habit of expecting people to work overtime without being paid and being extra for it was something that is reasonable, then I think that's quite a good thing as well, to be honest.
Okay, and in practical terms, I think that a different national living wage would be quite difficult to implement. What do you think is the appetite for getting this sort of recommendation?
Well, we've got 2 living wages already because we've got the youth rate as well. But the Low Pay Commission are consulting about it, and I went and spoke to the Low Pay Commission, and they were very mixed about it. And I trust the Low Pay Commission. They are one of the few tripartite bodies that we've got, where you've got unions, you've got employers, you've got independent experts, and I trust their judgment. And they are very precious. For them, the minimum wage is very precious. They won't want to do anything which makes it harder for people to understand it or to implement it. So, you know, I think the beauty of my proposal is it's a market mechanism. You have to remember that a lot of people's pressure on me, and it is, I think, Labour Party policy, is to abolish 0 hours contracts or to abolish minimum low hour contracts. I didn't want to use that. I thought it was a very blunt tool, and I think a lot of people who work those contracts are happy with them. So I wanted a market mechanism that simply said to employers, if you want that flexibility, pay a bit extra for it. So I'll see what the Low Pay Commission say. If they simply say, well, we can't do it, I do think it then begs the question, what should we do to ensure fairness in those cases where employers are requiring people to work without any security simply because it makes their life easier?
Yes, no, understood. And I guess from our perspective, giving that extra commitment to workers and that 2 weeks' notice is something that is just part and parcel of the way we see doing business, so therefore it's not an issue to us. But okay. And Swedish derogation is another important topic. So today we've probably got around 10,000 workers out deployed on Swedish derogation contracts. So in our experience, they work for our workers because they give them pay between assignments. We operate that absolutely into the letter and the spirit of the intended part of the legislation, and our customers are happy. What's wrong with Swedish derogation?
Yeah, the Swedish derogation. There were moments when I was doing the review and I thought, what have I done in my life to be sitting in a room for 4 hours discussing the Swedish derogation? It reminded me that when I ran IPPR, at the think tank IPPR. This was when the first days of the internet,
Yeah.
and we put all our reports online, and nobody ever read any of them. Who reads a policy document in their spare time? Well, I do actually, but that's because I'm sad. Anyway, but I got the figures, and there was one document that got like 150 times as many views as any other IPPR publication. And it's amazing. What is this? It must be fantastic. It was only then that I realised it was a document about Scandinavian welfare, and it was called Lessons from the Swedish Model. So I think there was quite a lot of disappointed people out there. Really, that maybe introduced people to a whole new world. Anyway, the Swedish delegation. Look, what the government has said about the Swedish delegation, I think, is sensible. What they've said, and what I heard, was quite a lot of misuse. You know, people being brought into an office for 2 hours. To break up the time and then being sent back to work, not being given any real choice over it. And what the government has said is, look, and I've just got to be grown up about this. No regulation is perfect. You know, if there was any policy out there that was perfect, it would have been implemented a long time ago. All policies have got pros and cons. The government's view, in my view, is if it is true, and they're surveying now, if it is true, and the TUC will be trying to persuade them that it is, that there is widespread abuse of this, then it may simply be that abuse, that danger of abuse, is so great that it cancels out the fact that for some people it is used legitimately. And after all, there's nothing to stop agencies having people on permanent contracts anyway. So most of the things that people might want with a Swedish derogation, you can get through other means rather than using it. But the government has equally said, if we find that there isn't that widespread abuse, then we will tackle it not through a change in the regulation, but through better enforcement. And again, regardless of my political background, I kind of understand how hard government is, and I think this government, given the hospital pass that the British people gave it in the referendum vote, is doing the best that it can in difficult circumstances. And I think that's the right approach. So we'll see what the survey comes back with. Yeah. If it does come back with widespread abuse, then I think, as I say, the balance of risk is probably the risk of losing some of the advantages is probably outweighed by the risk of people continuing to be subject to. And the problem of loopholes, of course, is there are just lots of clever people out there looking for them.
And of course, you mentioned the unions are sort of actively reviewing this. Do you get the sense then that the unions having been quite supportive of the Swedish derogation when it was introduced, are not anymore at all? Well, no,
what happened was that the Labour government, wanted to introduce the Agency Workers Directive, it kind of half had to as a consequence of being part of the European Union. And in order to get the CBI's agreement to the implementation of the Agency Workers Agreement, they had to agree to the Swedish derogation. So the TUC never wanted it. And part of the CBI's argument is that we agreed, whenever it was, 12 years ago, to support the Agency Workers Directive on the basis of the derogation. And now you're taking it away, which I think, well, you had 12 years, or 15 years, how long you've had. So it was never that the trade unions were happy with it. It was always part of the deal. And they legitimately now want to say, look, we'll keep the directive, but we don't need to keep the derogation anymore.
Yeah.
And I have heard, by the way, that agencies say we're not particularly bothered by it. Some of our clients want it, and if we could say to our clients you can't have it, it wouldn't necessarily be the end of the world. But I won't ask you to comment on
it. We're very happy to supply the service our clients want to supply, but equally we have no issues whatsoever in our business with Swedish derogation because pay between assignments is simply not an issue for us. We have a network that's comprehensive enough to redeploy. So. And we want to be it. So, from our perspective, we welcome more compliance, we welcome more regulation, because we're doing the right thing, and absolutely. And just sticking with the unions for a second, did they have much influence in the way that you put your report together, or in the consultation phase? Are they happy with what you've written?
Well, I mean. Yeah, the unions were involved, and we did hearings all around the country, and there were many union reps who spoke at those hearings, and of course the unions all submitted evidence. Because of the relationship between the Labour Party and the trade unions, and the fact that I worked for the great saving Tony Blair, the political position was one of hostility to me, and
I briefed Trade Union General Secretaries about the report the day before it was published, and I think their general view was, as they were speaking to me, was, that's quite good, but the next day I was feeble, pathetic, sell out, blah 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 blah. So, I'm a fan of trade unionism, and I studied industrial relations at university. I've always believed, and this is a separate topic, but I've always believed that people talk about the relationship between the Labour Party and the trade unions, and they say, does the relationship damage the Labour Party? I'm not sure about that. I think if it does damage, it's the trade unions, because the fact that most people read about trade unions, not in terms of the good work they do defending workers and actually being part of good workplaces, but general secretaries throwing their weight around in terms of trying to influence what Jeremy Corbyn does, I think it's catastrophic for the way in which the union movement is perceived. So I think in terms of the content and the industrial relations side of it, good engagement with the unions, and I think they would say, there's good stuff here, they would want to go further, but the kind of official and political position was different. It's the same with the Labour Party. Officially the Labour Party was very lukewarm, but the individual Labour MPs I've spoken to and shadow ministers have been much more engaged.
So can you tell us a bit about your recommendation, the right to request permanent work?
It's like the Today programme, isn't it? Yeah. A friendly Today programme. Sorry, right to request.
Yeah.
So the right to request is a right to request a permanent contract for people who have either been in temporary work or with variable hours for a 12-month period. Again, it's one of those areas where I got kind of pushed from both sides. So some people say, well, this is onerous for business. Other people, not just unions, but very thoughtful organisations like the Resolution Foundation said you're not going far enough. It ought to be a mandatory right to a permanent contract after 12 months. I resisted that for the same reason that I've gone into, which is that I think flexible work is good, and I worried that I worried two things. First of all, if you made it mandatory, you would get gaming, so you get people being laid off after 11 months. So that's the problem with any of these kind of deadlines. And secondly, I worried that it would lead to some jobs just not being made available. People say, well, I don't want to risk creating that temporary job in case it becomes a permanent one. But I do think the right to request is an important thing. It's worked to a reasonable extent, I think, in terms of flexible around parental and caring responsibilities, the right to request flexible work. The one thing that I think is important is that employers beyond a certain size would have to report on how many requests they'd received and how many they'd acceded to. So if a company was routinely just saying no to all requests, that would be something that they could be held to account for.
Yeah, and we completely support that. And I'll actually go one stage further to say that we wouldn't be too afraid of the right to actually have permanent work. But that is because we benefit from the scale and we can do that. But we fully support that. So we're just sort of coming towards the end of our time slot. So Matthew, is there anything that I haven't asked you in terms of that? Yeah, it was probably the best way to, in terms of the sort of those general key questions that you tend to get asked. Or actually the other way of putting it is, in your dream sort of scenario, what would you like to see as the output of your review? Where do you, looking back in a few years' time, what would you be really satisfied if has been achieved?
Well, I think, so I'll say three things. Firstly, some material improvements in the protections and rights of people at the bottom end of the labour market. That's what I was particularly being asked to look at, and I've suggested steps I think could make a material difference to that, and I think it's important that we do, because if we don't, you'll continue to get press stories week in, week out about people being treated unreasonably and unfairly. So protections for people at the bottom end, a framework in relation to employment status and other matters which is clearer, and there's a whole issue of tax which we haven't really talked about. So a better understood and more consistent framework. Secondly, the acceptance of this idea of good work, which I've talked about and kind of about it again, but this idea of good work really enters the bloodstream, and people feel that we have overcome that master and servant view, and that view that there will always be rubbish jobs. And thirdly, that we'll start to see a little bit more of a kind of grown-up conversation between employers, employees, trade unions. We kind of, because of what happened in the 1970s in this country, the level of industrial conflict and fall of the Labour government as a consequence, we developed a kind of hostility to the idea of tripartitism, government, employers and employees sorting out issues. Now this government, to their credit, have kind of slightly overcome that. They're talking about sector deals, they're talking about sector arrangements, they've created the National Retraining Council, which is the unions and the employers and the government. And in other countries they just don't have that hang up. In other countries, one of the reasons they have better work and they have better productivity actually is because employers and employee representatives get together and they work together to say how can our sector be a high productivity and effective sector. So the third thing is I'm pleased to start to see small steps towards that kind of model in Britain. Again, it did go wrong in the 70s because the trade unions were too powerful and because they had too narrow a worldview, but I think it could work much better now.
So thank you very much indeed for coming along today. I hope that you found that very useful indeed. So in overall terms, we're very comfortable at Staffline that we can continue to deliver a great service to all of you, our clients. But key to the success of doing that in a tight labour market, we really feel, is employee engagement to a far higher level than we've done before. So we are determined to ensure that we are always the first choice for anybody that wants to work flexibly in our sectors, and that's very important to us. We're here for you to help make you more successful to every extent that we can. That's it. Thank you very much indeed.